Every person in that market walked past her. Every single one. Except him. He swung down from the saddle and the quiet woman with the straw basket didn't. She looked at him the way you look at the Duke of Hatherley lowers himself to a stone step in the market square, and the quiet woman with the straw basket watches without surprise. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us set the scene properly, because this market, this ordinary, unremarkable Thursday market at Thornfield, deserves its portrait painted in full before we watch it crack down the middle. Thornfield Market occupied a cobbled square bordered on three sides by limestone buildings gone the color of old teeth, and on the fourth by a low wall beyond which the Ashworth lands rolled away in a green so deep it looked almost hostile. The square itself was a study in the precise choreography of English commerce, which is to say, a study in who mattered and who did not. The draper's stall nearest the church steps sold Holland cloth at 4 shillings the yard, and the women who lingered there wore kid gloves and did not carry their own parcels. The turnip cart at the far end moved roots at 4p the bunch, and the women who stopped there had red knuckles and baskets they carried themselves. Between these two poles, the whole machinery of a country town arranged itself with the ruthless efficiency of a clock. The butcher at 7p a pound for mutton, the baker whose penny loaves were a penny and a half since Michaelmas, and whose 2-pound wheat rounds cost exactly what the name promised. The vicar passed through at 11 o'clock precisely, nodding to the draper's customers and not seeing the turnip women at all. 2 gentlewomen in matching blue pelisses paused to examine ribbon at 6p the length, their maid standing 4 feet behind them, holding a package she was not invited to set down. The fishmonger shouted his prices. A boy swept horse dung from the stones for a halfpenny. The whole square hummed with the sound of people who knew exactly where they stood, and would not dream of standing anywhere else. Into this arrangement rode Edmund Ashworth, 6th Duke of Hatherley, on a dark bay gelding that was worth more than every stall in the market combined. He did not ride through for the pleasure of it. He was bound for the eastern edge of his holdings, a tenant property at Bracken Farm whose books had not balanced in 2 quarters, and whose steward had begun writing letters full of elaborate explanations, which is always the first sign that a man is stealing from you. Edmund had been duke for 3 years. In that time, he had discovered that his late wife, Charlotte, had married not him, but his title, had said so plainly to her sister in a letter he found 7 months after the funeral, the ink still sharp, the words sharper. He is useful in the way furniture is useful and about as interesting. His closest friend, Arthur Graves, a man he had trusted with the household accounts, with the wine cellar key, with the name of his dead mother's favorite hymn, had embezzled £6,000 over 18 months, and when confronted, had smiled and said, "Well, what did you expect? You have so much you didn't even notice." That smile. That damned reasonable smile. Edmund had learned its lesson well. Every kindness aimed at a duke is a transaction. Every warm hand extended toward a fortune is already calculating what it can hold. So he rode through Thornfield with his dark chestnut hair wind loosened against his collar, his charcoal wool coat unbuttoned, no cravat, the brass pocket watch on its leather fob catching the thin October light at his waist. And he looked at no one. because looking at people invited them to want something from him. And he was very nearly out of whatever it is that lets a man bear being wanted for the wrong reasons. He almost passed the woman on the ground entirely.
She was sitting.
No, she had collapsed, her back against the stone base of the market cross, one leg bent beneath her at an angle that suggested she had not chosen to sit so much as the ground had chosen for her. An older woman, her shawl trailing in the mud, her face gray with the particular gray that is not dirt, but exhaustion pushed past its limit. A cup of water sat untouched beside her, placed there perhaps an hour ago by someone who had not stayed. The draper glanced over and returned to his cloth. The vicar adjusted his hat and walked on. The two gentlewomen in blue pelisses looked away, looked at each other, and decided without a word that this was not their concern. A servant carrying a crate of apples stepped around the woman's outstretched foot the way one steps around a puddle, with mild annoyance and no curiosity. 30 seconds passed. Edmund counted them. He was good at counting now. He counted everything: pounds, betrayals, the number of people in a room who were lying to him at any given moment. No one stopped. He dismounted. The gelding's reins he looped once around a post, loosely, the way a man does when he does not intend to be long, but does not intend to leave either. Then the Duke of Hatherley, 11,000 pounds a year, 40 rooms at Hatherley Park, a seat in the Lords he had not once occupied, walked to the market cross and lowered himself to the cold stone step beside a woman he had never met. He did not speak. He did not offer money. He did not summon anyone. He simply sat, his broad shoulders level, his hands resting on his knees, his gray-blue eyes fixed on nothing in particular, and waited. The crowd noticed. A well-dressed man sitting in the gutter draws the eye the way a shout does not. Murmuring began, low, uncertain, the particular English murmur that means someone has broken a rule no one can quite name. From across the square, Theodora Lennox watched. She had already been moving. Her small woven straw basket was in the crook of her left arm, the linen cloth folded back, a quarter loaf of bread in her hand, pulled from her own supply, not purchased for charity, but redirected from her own supper. Her faded sage-green dress caught no light. Her honey-gold hair was braided tight and pinned in its low coil. Her hazel-green eyes, direct and level beneath their arched light brown brows, were fixed on the man who had just sat down in the dirt beside a stranger. She stopped. Not because he had solved anything, because she recognized the gesture. She knew what it looked like when a person sat down next to suffering without trying to fix it, purchase it, or perform it, because she had done it herself, more times than she could count, in rooms no one important ever entered. His guards arrived then, 2 men on horseback, liveried, alarmed, already calling out, "Your Grace," in voices pitched between deference and panic. The crowd heard the title, and the murmur became a gasp. The Duke of Hatherley, in the dirt. The vicar turned back. The gentlewomen stared. Edmund stood, brushed the dust from his charcoal coat with one hand, and remounted with the unhurried economy of a man who has done nothing remarkable and knows it. He gathered the reins. He turned the gelding toward the eastern road, and his gaze caught hers across the square. One breath. That was all. The tall man on the dark horse, the small woman with the basket and the bread still in her hand, and between them, 20 yards of cobblestone and the whole weight of a world that had already decided what each of them was worth. She did not curtsy. she did not look away. She held his gaze with a steady, unsurprised calm of a woman who had been expecting exactly this, or something like it, her whole life. Not a duke in the dirt. Something smaller and larger than that. A person who meant it. Edmund remounts and rides on without looking back. But the image of the woman's steady, unsurprised eyes stays lodged beneath his ribs like a splinter he cannot name. Theodora Lennox's life in 7 rooms and 47 shillings a quarter. The cottage at the edge of Thornfield Parish. 7 rooms is generous, mind you. 2 of them were barely closets. One served as both pantry and linen store, and the bedroom under the eaves required a woman of precisely 5'3" to stand upright at its center and nowhere else. But they were hers. Every cracked plaster wall, every draft that slipped beneath the kitchen door in January, every stubborn iron hinge she had oiled with her own hands, hers, paid for, owed to no one. And that, dear listener, was the whole of Theodora Lennox's religion. Her father had been a gentleman, not a great one, not the sort whose name echoed through ballrooms or appeared in parliamentary registers, but a real one, a man who held Lennox freehold on 40 acres of decent soil and kept his tenants warm and his debts small. He died in the winter of 1811, and within 9 months the estate was seized through a disputed debt so tangled in forged signatures and missing receipts that 3 solicitors charged £400 between them and still could not untangle it. The house went. The land went. The name stayed, because a name is the one thing creditors cannot auction. Theodora kept the name, and she kept herself. 14 hives she maintained along the south-facing stone wall behind the cottage, each one built from salvaged pine and sealed with her own wax. The bees earned her roughly 9 shillings a quarter in honey and 4 more in candles, if the season was kind. She sewed for 3 shillings a dress. Plain work, sturdy seams, nothing fashionable, the sort of sewing that kept a farmer's wife decent on a Sunday. Twice a week she walked 2 miles to the Pryor farm and taught 3 young women their letters, their figures, and enough geography to know that the world extended past the hedgerow. For this, she received 1 shilling per lesson and, occasionally, a round of cheese. 47 shillings a quarter. That was the arithmetic of her survival. It left nothing for vanity, nothing for waste, and precisely enough for a woman who had long ago decided that sufficiency was not the lesser cousin of abundance, but its superior. She owed nothing. She owned almost nothing, and she answered to no one. Which is precisely why Mr. Josiah Pell found her so irritating. Now, let us speak of Pell. Josiah Pell was the sort of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. He held the note on Lennox freehold, had purchased it from the original creditor for 60 cents on the pound, a transaction he described as merely tidying up a messy affair. He had been tidying up messy affairs across 4 parishes for the better part of a decade, buying small debts the way other men collected snuff boxes, one at a time, patiently, with a connoisseur's eye for the piece that completed a set. A widow's overdue account at the chandler, a tenant farmer's missed rent, a blacksmith's loan for a new forge bellows. Each debt was tiny. Together they formed a web, and Pell sat at its center with his pale brown eyes half-lidded and his pleasant closed-mouth smile fixed in place, turning his gold signet ring inward so the crest pressed into a soft palm, and waited. He arrived at Theodora's cottage on a Tuesday in late April, riding a rented mare he had no business sitting. The animal was too fine for him, and knew it. He ducked through her low doorway without being invited, settled himself in her kitchen chair as though he had been expected, and accepted tea with the grace of a man accepting tribute. The debt he mentioned was 11 pounds for candles and lamp oil, allegedly owed by her late father to a chandler in Barrowbridge. The receipt was 17 years old. The chandler was dead. The debt may or may not have been real, and Pell knew perfectly well that this ambiguity was the point. Not the money, but the uncertainty. The way it let him sit in her kitchen and take up space. He complimented her honey. He remarked on the neatness of her garden. And 3 times, he mentioned how difficult it must be for a woman alone. A woman alone, without family, without protection, he said, adjusting the gold pin in his starched white cravat. One does worry. That word, protection. He laid it on the table like a card turned face up and smiled his shallow, dimpled smile and waited for her to pick it up. Theodora did not pick it up. She stood at her kitchen table with her cream linen apron tied at the waist, her honey gold hair braided tight and pinned low, the tiny dark beauty mark on her right cheekbone catching the afternoon light, and she told him she would review the ledger. If the debt was real, she would pay it at 2 shillings a month. She did not thank him for his concern. She did not smile. Her hazel-green eyes held his with the level, unhurried patience of a woman who had been looked through by better men than Josiah Pell, and had not blinked then either. That was it. No argument, no plea, just arithmetic and a door she did not open wider. Pell left the cottage with his pleasant expression perfectly intact, because men like Pell always leave with their expressions intact. That is what makes them dangerous. Now, 12 miles east and a world apart, in the dining room of Hatherley Park, Lady Marguerite Ashworth was conducting surgery without anesthetic. She sat across the supper table from her great-nephew, 5'1", of silver-white hair and pale, sharp blue eyes, the tortoise-shell comb in her high chignon catching candlelight, her ebony cane resting against the table's edge like a weapon set briefly aside. She had watched 3 dukes and outlived 2 of them. She had earned the right to say exactly what she meant. "A man who trusts no one," she said, her thin voice precise as a struck bell, "is not strong, Edmund. He is merely alone." Edmund set down his glass. His gray-blue eyes moved to the window. His dark chestnut hair, wind-loosened from the day's ride, fell past his collar, and the brass pocket watch at his waist caught the light as he shifted. He changed the subject. She let him, because Lady Marguerite had outlived 2 dukes, and she understood that some truths must be planted like seeds and left alone in the dark before they will grow. 3 parishes away, Pell climbed back onto his rented mare. He smiled, adjusted his gold signet ring, and told the empty road he would return in a fortnight to discuss the matter further. And this is how a man like Pell always begins. Pleasantly, patiently, with all the time in the world. 3 days after the market, Edmund returns to Thornfield, not for the property inspection he missed, but for a reason he cannot yet articulate even to himself. And the town disappoints him. That is the only word for it. He rides in on a Tuesday morning, the brass pocket watch at his waist catching the early light, and Thornfield is just a town. Ordinary, unremarkable. The cobblestones are the same cobblestones, the baker's awning is the same faded blue. The square where a man had raised a crop to a horse's flank and a woman with a straw basket had stepped between them is just a square now, swept clean and smelling of nothing more dramatic than warm bread and horse dung.
Whatever had cracked open in that space 3 days ago had sealed itself shut again, and the town had gone on breathing without him, which of course it had, because towns do not need dukes, whatever dukes may tell themselves. His steward, a man named Hargrove, who had served the Ashworth estate for 19 years, rode beside him and said nothing about the missed inspection, because Hargrove was paid handsomely to know when silence was worth more than competence. Edmund asked the question casually.
Too casually. The kind of careful nothing that fools no one. The woman at the market, Saturday. She carried a straw basket. Sold honey, I believe. Hargrove didn't blink. Miss Lennox, Your Grace. The beekeeper. Daughter of the late Mr. Lennox, Arthur Lennox, who held the freehold on the Briar Hill cottage and the 4 acres south of the mill road. Estate was lost some years back. Debts. She kept the cottage and the hives. Lives alone. Sells honey and beeswax at market. Does some mending for the draper's wife. Quiet sort. Pays her rates on time. Pays her rates on time. 4 words that told him more about Miss Lennox than a letter of introduction ever could. A woman alone, on 4 acres, with bees and needle and whatever iron lived in her spine, and she paid her rates on time. He turned that fact over in his mind the way a man turns a coin he suspects is counterfeit, looking for the flaw, and found none. He went to her cottage unannounced, alone. No steward, no groom, no crest on the saddle. Just the plain dark charcoal wool riding coat, unbuttoned, the cream linen shirt open at the throat where a cravat should have been and wasn't, the tall black boots dusted with 3 miles of road dirt. He looked, if he was honest with himself, which he rarely was, like a man of moderate means on moderate business. A farmer, maybe. A land agent. Nobody. The cottage was small and clean and set back from the lane behind a low stone wall that had been repaired so many times it was more mortar than stone. He tied his horse to the gatepost. He walked up the path. He knocked. She opened the door with her hands still damp, a linen cloth tucked into the waist of her cream apron, the small woven straw basket sitting on the table behind her with its cloth folded neatly over whatever it held. The honey-gold hair was braided and pinned in that low coil at her nape, and a wisp had escaped at her left temple, and she did not push it back. The beauty mark on her right cheekbone caught the light from the doorway like a period at the end of a sentence. "I'd like to buy honey," he said. She looked at him, level, direct, those hazel-green eyes measuring him exactly the way they'd measured the distance between a crop and a horse's flank 3 days ago, with precision, without fear, without any particular interest in whether he liked being measured. 1 shilling 4 for the large jar, 10 pence for the small. The large. She turned, fetched a jar from the shelf behind the table, set it on the edge nearest him. He placed the coins in her palm. Their fingers did not touch. She counted the money, nodded once, and that was the transaction. Done. Complete. No smile offered as change, no curtsy, no flutter of lashes, no sidelong glance, no performance of gratitude that a man had deigned to appear at her door and spend 1 shilling 4 pence. She treated him exactly as she would treat any stranger standing in her doorway, with courtesy, without curiosity, without the faintest interest in who he might be or what he might want beyond what he had stated. And Edmund Ashworth, 6th Duke of Hatherley, master of £11,000 a year and 40 empty rooms and a name that made men stand straighter when they heard it. Edmund was undone by this, quietly, completely.
standing in a doorway with a jar of honey in his hand and no idea what to do with the sudden, absurd, devastating freedom of being no one. He lingered. He knew he was lingering. He asked about the bees. She answered him the way she did everything, precisely, without embellishment, without the slightest concession to charm. The hives were skep hives, 8 of them, kept along the south wall of the garden where the morning sun hit first. The yield this year was fair, not exceptional. The clover had been thin. The season had been wet. She lost one colony in March to damp and rebuilt it from a split in April. He listened the way a man dying of thirst listens to the sound of water.
Her garden spread behind the cottage in neat, deliberate rows. He could see it past her shoulder through the open back door. Herbs, vegetables, lavender planted not for beauty, but for the bees. A small apple tree, espaliered flat against the stone wall to catch every hour of sun the English sky would spare. Nothing decorative, nothing wasted. Every plant serving a purpose, every inch of soil earning its keep. It was the opposite of everything he owned. Small, where his was vast. Complete, where his was hollow. Alive, where his was merely maintained. He asked if she was at the market 3 days ago. She said yes. He asked if she saw what happened. She said yes. He waited, and he did not know he was waiting, but he was. The way a man who has been applauded his whole life waits for applause without hearing himself listen for it. He waited for her to say something admiring about what he had done. She did not. She handed him a cup of honey water without a word, and he drank it standing in her garden among the hives, and neither of them spoke. And the silence was the first honest thing that had happened to him in 3 years. He came back the next week, and the week after that. Always on pretext. Honey, a question about beeswax for the estate's candles, a request for the name of her linen supplier. Every time, the same worn brass pocket watch on its leather fob catching the light at his waist. Every time, the same dark charcoal riding coat unbuttoned over a cream linen shirt with no cravat. The same road dust on his tall black boots, as though the Duke of Hatherley were merely some minor estate worker with errands to run and nowhere particular to be. And every time, Theodora Lennox met him at the door of Lennox Freehold with the same level, unsurprised courtesy, the same firm, narrow jaw, the same clear hazel-green eyes that looked at him without looking up to him, and sold him exactly what he asked for at exactly the price she named, and did not smile more than was civil, and did not ask a single question about who he was or why he kept returning. She never asked. That's the part that undid him. She never asked. Weekly became twice weekly. The pretexts grew thinner. He needed, apparently, to know the ideal temperature for rendering beeswax. He needed to understand the difference between comb honey and strained honey. He needed, and this one even he must have known was ridiculous, to consult her on the proper linen for straining tallow. She answered every question the same way, directly, completely, without flattery, and then she returned to whatever she had been doing before he arrived, which was always something because Theodora Lennox was always doing something. During one visit, the 5th or perhaps the 6th, he had stopped counting because counting would mean admitting this had become a pattern. He found her in the low-ceilinged kitchen with a chair turned upside down on the table. One hinge had snapped clean off. She had a strip of leather, a single nail, and a small hammer, and she fixed it in under 2 minutes. No fuss, no muttering, no glance toward him to see if he was watching. She simply wrapped the leather around the broken joint, drove the nail through with 2 precise strikes, tested the weight, set the chair right side up,
and sat in it to make sure it held. Her hands, slim, wiry, with visible tendon at the wrists, moved the way hands move when they have mended 1,000 things and expect to mend 1,000 more, because no one is coming. No one has ever been coming. Something shifted in Edmund Ashworth's chest. Not a grand thing, not a thunderclap. More like a hinge giving way, quietly, irreversibly, in a door he had nailed shut 3 years ago.
And right there, standing in a kitchen that smelled of beeswax and dried rosemary, watching a woman in a faded sage-green dress with mended seams at the elbows sit down in a chair she had just repaired with a strip of leather and a single nail, the Duke of Hatherley understood that he was in love, and that the woman he loved did not know his name. The deception had calcified around him. He could not tell her now. If he told her now, every visit became a lie retroactively. Every question about beeswax became a duke's condescension. Every cup of honey water she had handed him without a word became charity given under false pretenses, and she would never forgive that. Because Theodora Lennox did not give charity. She sold goods and answered questions and extended courtesy, all at fair value, all on level ground. And if the ground had never been level, if he had been standing 6 inches above her the entire time on the invisible platform of 11,000 pounds a year, then she had been cheated of the only thing she valued more than her 11 shillings. Her honesty. He couldn't tell her. He couldn't stop coming back. The trap was perfect, because he had built it himself. Now, Lady Marguerite Ashworth, 82 years old, 5'1", silver-white hair swept into a high chignon secured with a single tortoiseshell comb, pale, sharp blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Lady Marguerite had spies everywhere. Not paid spies, worse. She had people who loved her, which meant people who told her things for free, which meant her intelligence network was entirely volunteer and therefore impossible to bribe, threaten, or shut down. She learned about the visits within the first fortnight. She did not confront Edmund. That would have been too easy. Instead, she visited Theodora herself, on pretext of buying honey. She arrived in a small carriage, tapped her ebony cane with its silver fist-shaped handle up the garden path, sat in Theodora's kitchen for 40 minutes, drank 2 cups of honey water, asked 7 precise questions about the keeping of bees, purchased a single jar of lavender honey for 3 shillings, and left, knowing everything she needed to know. That evening she found Edmund in the study at Hatherley Park. She did not sit down. She stood with both hands folded over the silver handle of her cane, the small, dark mole at the corner of her left eyebrow raised along with the eyebrow itself, and said, "The beekeeper is not a fool, Edmund. She will find out, and when she does, the question will be whether you were a liar or merely a coward, and I am not certain which she will forgive less." He said nothing. She left. The cane tapped its way down the corridor, like a metronome counting out the time he had left. But here's where the story cracks open. Edmund's steward, a careful man, a man of ledgers and figures, brought him a report the following morning, not about honey, about debt. Josiah Pell had been buying up obligations across the eastern parish. Small debts, a farrier's unpaid account here, a widow's overdue rent there, 11 shillings for candles, 42 shillings for seed, £7 for a fence repair never completed. Individually, nothing. Collectively, a pattern. Patient, smiling, reasonable, relentless. Exactly like the man himself, with his oiled, sandy hair combed carefully forward, his gold signet ring turned inward so the crest pressed into his soft palm, his head tilted to one side in that performance of listening he had perfected. Pell wasn't collecting debts. He was collecting people, pressing each one gently, pleasantly, until they sold. And the property he wanted, the one every consolidated debt pointed toward like spokes toward a hub, was Lennox Freehold. Because Lennox Freehold sat on the only road between the Eastern Farms and the Thornfield Market. Whoever held that road held the throat of the entire parish's commerce. 11 shillings for candles. That was never about candles. And there it is, the pivot, the hinge. The moment the small story of a duke buying honey from a beekeeper becomes something else entirely. Pell does not want Theodora's 11 shillings. Pell wants Lennox Freehold. And Theodora is standing on the last piece of ground between him and the whole eastern parish. Pell returned to Theodora's cottage on the 14th day, exactly as promised, smiling, patient, with all the time in the world. He brought 2 more pieces of paper. That is what men like Josiah Pell do. They do not arrive with threats. They arrive with paper, because paper is quieter than a fist and holds up better in court. £3 for seed purchased the previous autumn from a supplier in Renford. £2 for a fence post repair carried out by a man Theodora had believed was doing her a neighborly turn. £5 total, added to the 11 shillings already owed, and now the number had teeth. He sat in her kitchen, the one she scrubbed with her own hands every morning before the sun cleared the hedgerow, and he folded those soft, damp palms over his waistcoat and tilted his head to one side in that patient, listening pose of his, the gold signet ring on his right pinky catching the light, turned inward so the crest pressed into his palm like a secret he enjoyed keeping. And he said, with all the warmth of a man offering directions to a lost traveler, that perhaps the simplest solution would be for Miss Lennox to sell the cottage, the land, the freehold her father had held and his father before him. He had a buyer, he said. The price would be fair. She could take rooms in town, pleasant rooms, he was sure, with a window and perhaps a small garden. He said the word garden the way you'd offer a dog a treat. And Theodora Lennox, 5'3" in her sturdy laced half boots with the wear showing at the toes, her honey gold hair braided and pinned in its low coil, her hazel green eyes level as a carpenter's line, looked at Josiah Pell across her own kitchen table and said no. Not loudly, not with drama. She said it the way you'd state the time of day. She would not sell. She would not move. She would pay every debt at 2 shillings a month if she must, if it took her until she was 50, if it took her until she was dead. But she would not be moved from her ground. This cottage was hers. This land was hers. And no amount of pleasant smiling and reasonable suggestions and paper produced from coat pockets would change the fact that she had not asked for his help, had not invited his counsel, and did not require his buyer. Pell smiled. Of course he smiled. He said he understood. He said he admired her spirit. He said he would leave the papers with her so she could think it over. He never raised his voice. He never raised his voice because he never needed to. The voice was not the weapon. The patience was. He was walking down the lane, that measured, unhurried gait of his carrying him past the hawthorn hedge, when Edmund Ashworth came up the track on horseback. Now, Pell did not recognize the man. Edmund wore no cravat. His dark charcoal riding coat was unbuttoned and road-dusted, his dark chestnut hair wind-loosened past his collar. He looked like what he had been pretending to be, a man of some modest means, a buyer of honey, nobody in particular. But Pell recognized the horse, a Hatherley Park animal, long-legged and well-kept, with the Ashworth brand on its saddle blanket. The pale brown eyes narrowed for just a moment, half-lidded, calculating, filing the information away, and then Pell tipped his hat and walked on, the faint birthmark on his neck disappearing beneath his collar as he turned. Edmund entered the cottage and found Theodora standing at the table, composed, rigid, her hands flat on the wood as though holding it down. The small woven straw basket sat untouched in the crook of her left arm. She had not even set it aside, had not even given Pell the courtesy of settling in while he tried to buy her life out from under her. She did not tell him what Pell wanted. She offered him tea. But Edmund's gray-blue eyes had already found the 3 death notices laid out on the table like cards in a game she had not agreed to play. He picked one up, read the figure, £3 for seed. She took it from his hand, not roughly, with a precision that said everything her mouth would not. "This is mine, not yours, and you do not get to hold it, and you do not get to fix it, and you do not get to look at me with that expression that sits halfway between pity and anger, because I have no use for either." He offered to help. He said he had some means. He did not say what means, did not say 12,000 a year, did not say 40 empty bedrooms, did not say Duke of Hatherley. He said he could speak to someone about the debts. He could make inquiries. Theodora set the debt notice back on the table, aligned its edge with the others, and spoke 7 words that hit him like a door swung shut on his fingers. "I do not accept help I cannot price." Edmund heard his great-aunt's voice in those words. He heard 82 years of Lady Marguerite's pale, sharp blue eyes cutting through every act of charity that was really a leash. And he understood, with a clarity that sat in his chest like a stone, that Theodora Lennox had already learned the lesson it had taken him 34 years and a dukedom to even approach, that a gift with invisible terms is not a gift. It is a purchase. He rode home to Hatherley Park and told Lady Marguerite everything. She listened from her chair, the ebony cane with its silver fist-shaped handle resting against her knee, the tortoiseshell comb catching lamplight in her white hair. She did not interrupt. She did not nod. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, and then she delivered the line that would keep him awake for 3 nights running. "You are in love with a woman who will not be rescued, and you are hiding from her the one fact that would make her refuse you forever. You are not protecting her, Edmund. You are protecting yourself." He did not argue. He could not. The brass pocket watch at his waist ticked into the silence like a judge's gavel. Edmund resolved to tell Theodora the truth. But first he had to deal with Pell, not with force, not with rank, but by making the man irrelevant, by pulling every thread Pell held until there was nothing left to grip. She closes the door of her cottage and stands with her back against it,
And for the first time in the story, the narrator tells us what Theodora Lennox feels, and what she feels is not gratitude, not relief, but a fury so clean and so bright it could light every lamp in the parish. The Duke of Hatherley did not confront Josiah Pell. That would have been the easy thing, and easy things had never once made Edmund Ashworth a better man. No. What he did was quieter and colder and far more devastating. He sent for his solicitor, a man named Hargrove, 61 years old, who had served the Ashworth estate since before Edmund's father died, and who asked no questions that were not billable. Edmund sat across from him in the study at Hatherley Park, the worn brass pocket watch turning slowly between his fingers, and gave a single instruction. Find every debt Josiah Pell holds in this parish, every note, every lien, every scrap of paper with his name on it. Trace them, price them, buy them. Hargrove did not blink. He asked only one question. "Through what name, Your Grace?" And Edmund said, "Not mine." It took 11 days, 47 debts, 47 families who owed Josiah Pell for seed, for fencing, for roof repairs done at twice the going rate, for loans extended with a smile and collected with a squeeze. Total value? £340.
Not even a rounding error in the Hatherley accounts. Edmund bought every single one through a third-party agent in Cheltenham. And then he did the thing that would make Pell's blood run sideways. He forgave them. Every one. Every penny. Burned the paper, released the claims, notified the debtors through Hargrove's office with a letter that said only, "Your obligation has been discharged in full." No signature. No return address. Pell woke up one morning with no leverage and no explanation. Imagine that. Imagine being a man whose entire empire is built on the slow, patient, smiling act of making people owe you. And then waking up to discover that the strings you held have all been cut, and you are standing in an empty room with your hands out, gripping nothing. He investigated, of course. A man like Pell always investigates. He pulled at threads, made inquiries, visited the solicitor's office in Cheltenham, bought a clerk a drink. Within a week, he had traced the purchases back to Hatherley Park. And here is what tells you everything about Josiah Pell. He was not angry. He was recalibrating. Anger is for men who feel wronged. Pell simply felt outmaneuvered, and outmaneuvered men adjust. So he paid a visit to Lady Marguerite Ashworth. She received him in her drawing room, perfectly erect in her high-collared plum silk, the jet buttons catching the afternoon light, the ebony cane resting across her knees like a scepter. She offered him exactly 1 cup of tea. 1, not 2. The distinction mattered, and she made damn sure he noticed it. Pell sat across from her, that gold signet ring turned inward against his palm, his head tilted in that patient listening pose, the one that said, "I have nowhere more important to be than wherever you are." He mentioned pleasantly that certain financial instruments in the parish had changed hands recently. He wondered, pleasantly, whether the estate had any insight into the matter. Lady Marguerite's pale, sharp blue eyes did not blink. The small, dark mole at the corner of her left eyebrow lifted slightly as she regarded him over the rim of her cup. "Mr. Pell," she said, "a man who uses debt as a weapon should not be surprised when someone with deeper pockets disarms him. You have been holding this parish by the purse strings for 6 years. The purse strings have been cut. I suggest you find another hobby."
Watercolors, perhaps. You have the temperament for something that washes away." Pell smiled. That shallow dimple appeared in his left cheek, pleasant as always, reasonable as always. Lady Marguerite did not smile. She rang for the maid to show him out. The interview had lasted 4 minutes. She had not offered him a biscuit. And then came the hardest ride Edmund Ashworth ever took. He saddled his horse, the same tall bay whose quality Theodora had noticed 7 weeks ago, because, of course, she had noticed, because Theodora Lennox noticed everything. And he rode to her cottage with 2 things in his coat: the truth and a chancery decree. His solicitor had petitioned on grounds that the original seizure of her father's freehold was procedurally flawed. Missing signatures, an improperly filed claim. The kind of bureaucratic rot that Pell had relied on, no one ever having the resources to challenge. Hargrove had challenged it. The court had agreed. The freehold was restored to the name of Lennox, legally, fully, irrevocably. Edmund stood in her garden. The bees moved around him in their ancient, indifferent circuits. Theodora came to the door in her faded sage-green dress, the cream apron tied at her waist, the small woven basket in the crook of her left arm. She looked at him with those clear hazel-green eyes, level, direct, waiting, and he told her. "My name is Edmund Ashworth. I am the Duke of Hatherley. I have been buying honey from you under false pretenses for 7 weeks. I have purchased and forgiven every debt Josiah Pell held against you and your neighbors,
And I have had your father's freehold restored to your name. I did all of this because I am in love with you, and I did none of it well." She listened. She did not cry. She did not thank him. She took the decree from his hand, read it carefully, every line, every seal, and set it on the table inside. And she came back to the doorway and told him a truth of her own. She knew. Not his name, not his title. But she knew he was not an ordinary man buying honey. She knew from the way he sat on the stone step at the market, from the quality of his boots, from the horse. She had chosen not to ask because the man who came to her door without his title was the first honest thing she had encountered in years. And now she learned he was not honest either. She would not be a reward for his grand gesture. She would not be the woman the Duke rescued. She would keep her freehold because it was legally hers. She would keep her cottage because it was hers. She would keep her bees because they were hers. But she would not keep him. Not like this. Theodora stands in the doorway of her cottage, the decree in one hand and the jar of honey in the other, and says to the Duke of Hatherley, "You should not have come here as anyone other than who you are. I would have told you the truth from the first day. You did not give me the same courtesy." And she closes the door. He did not come back the next day, or the day after. He did not send a letter or a gift or a proxy. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Hatherley did nothing. And the doing of nothing was the hardest thing he had ever done. 3 weeks, 21 days of silence so complete that the servants at Hatherley Park began to speak in whispers, as though someone had died and no one had thought to tell them who. Edmund rode every morning at dawn, the dark chestnut hair wind-loosened and wild by the time he returned, the brass pocket watch on its leather fob swinging against his hip with every stride. He ate alone. He read nothing. He walked the long gallery where 40 generations of Ashworth faces stared down from gilt frames, and not one of them had a damn thing useful to say. Lady Marguerite watched him from her chair by the fire, pale, sharp blue eyes tracking his restless circuit of the house, like a cat watching a bird beat itself against glass. She said nothing. For her, a woman who had once told the Prince Regent his waistcoat was an insult to silk, this was an act of almost superhuman restraint. She simply sat, the ebony cane with its silver fist resting across her knees, the tortoiseshell comb gleaming in her white hair, and waited for him to arrive at the conclusion she had reached 3 weeks ago. Meanwhile, Theodora went on living. That is what people like Theodora do. They go on. The bees needed tending, and she tended them. The sewing needed finishing, and she finished it. The 3 Hargrove sisters needed their Tuesday lesson, and she taught it, her voice steady, her hazel green eyes level, the tiny beauty mark on her right cheekbone catching the light when she turned to correct a stitch. She reviewed the Chancery decree a second time, then a third, running her finger along the seal until she was certain it would not dissolve under scrutiny. It was genuine. The freehold was hers. On the 4th day of Edmund's silence, she walked the boundary of her father's land for the first time in 6 years. The faded sage-green dress brushing through wet grass, the straw basket empty in the crook of her left arm because she had brought it out of habit and not need. She did not cry. She touched the gatepost, the one her father had set with his own hands, the wood silver gray now and splitting at the top, and she stood there for a long time. And what passed through her was not grief and not joy, but something older than both, something that had no name because the language had never needed one for a woman recovering what should never have been taken. Then Pell came. One last time.
Because men like Josiah Pell always come one last time. They cannot help it. The way a dog returns to a bone it is already gnawed clean. He arrived at her door in his pressed tan breeches and polished brass-buckled shoes, the gold signet ring turned inward on his pinky, that patient, pleasant smile fixed on his soft face like something nailed there. He leaned forward in that way he had, head tilted, hands clasped over his waistcoat, and he said, with the tone of a man offering reasonable advice to a child, that a woman who had attracted the attention of a duke might leverage that attention into something more comfortable. That was the word he used. Comfortable. As though Theodora were a chair that might be reupholstered to suit a better room. It was the cruelest thing he said in the whole of this story, because it reduced her to a commodity even in the act of acknowledging her victory, even while admitting he had lost. Theodora's response was 4 words long. She looked at him with those clear hazel-green eyes and said, "You may go now." The 4 finest words spoken in the county that year. Pell left. He did not return. He was not struck down or humiliated or dragged through the courts. He was simply made irrelevant. There was nothing left for him to hold, and a man who cannot hold has no hands, and a man with no hands cannot hurt you. Remember that. And Edmund, alone in the long gallery at Hatherley Park, the gray-blue eyes heavy-lidded and fixed on nothing, finally understood what Lady Marguerite had been telling him with her silence. He could not earn Theodora by giving things, not decrees, not freeholds, not the weight of his name stamped on official paper. He could only earn her by surrendering the one power he had carried like armor his entire life, the power to not be refused. He had to go to her with nothing, no title, no rescue, no grand gesture, just a man standing in a garden asking to be chosen, knowing she might say no, knowing the no would be permanent, and going anyway. He went to her cottage on a Thursday morning. He did not bring the decree, or a ring, or a carriage. He brought a jar, an empty jar, because he needed honey, because that is how they began. He stood at her door, tall, broad-shouldered, the charcoal riding coat unbuttoned, no cravat, road dirt on the black boots, the faint scatter of freckles visible across the bridge of his nose in the morning light, and he said, "I am not here as the Duke. I am here as the man who sat on the step. I am asking you to sell me honey, and if you will let me, I will sit in your garden and drink the honey water and tell you every true thing about myself, starting with the worst ones, and you may decide what to do with a man like that." Theodora looked at him for a long time. She did not smile. She opened the door. Years pass. They do that. And in the garden of a cottage that is neither grand nor small but exactly sufficient, two graying heads bend over a beekeeper's ledger, his chestnut gone silver at the temples, her honey gold dimmed to pale wheat. And the hard years are not erased. They are simply no longer the whole of the story. Lady Marguerite, 90 now and wrapped in 3 shawls, visits every Thursday and tells Edmund he is still not good enough for the beekeeper, and Theodora agrees, and Edmund says nothing, and the silence is the most honest sound in the room. Somewhere in the house, a brass pocket watch ticks on a shelf beside a woven straw basket, and neither is needed any more, and both are kept.